Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Bullock. I am the Director of Education and Visitor Services at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. We are so very excited to be partnering with the Jewish Museum of Maryland for this program. Thank you to all of the panelists that will be participating today. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Abe Kronsberg.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Abe Kronsberg, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, a member of Hizkiah Congregation, and part of the planning team behind this series, Jews of Color, Jewish Institutions, and Jewish Community in the Age of Black Lives Matter. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to our virtual program, presented in partnership with the Jewish Museum of Maryland, Hizkiah, and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. I'm going to soon be passing you along to our moderator this afternoon, Rabbi Jessie Drezin. Rabbi Drezin is the Executive Director for Repair the World, Baltimore. She has been in Baltimore since 2012. She founded Charm City Tribe and served as the Director of Jewish Life for the Jewish Community Center of Greater Baltimore. Rabbi Drezin received a BA in History from the University of Maryland, College Park, and an MA degree in Hebrew Letters and Jewish Education, as well as Rabbinic Ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. This afternoon, Rabbi Drezin will be interviewing Imani Chapman. Imani Romney Rosa Chapman is the founder of Imani Strategies. She has more than 25 years of experience organizing, educating, and developing curriculum for social justice. Whether as a leadership coach, facilitator, or trainer, Ms. Chapman's focus is on creating safe and inclusive environments for learning, growth, and justice. Ms. Chapman currently serves on the board of the Roger L. Wallace Excellence in Teaching Award Foundation, on the steering committee for the Coalition of Faith, Spiritual, Ethical Communities for the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and was founding co-chair for the Race Working Group of Kolat Chayenu Synagogue. She is also co-founder of Sisters of Color in Education and teaches part-time at Grace Church School in Manhattan. Ms. Chapman received her undergraduate degree in Communication, Education, and Performing Arts from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and her master's degree in Spanish Philology from Middlebury College, Madrid, Spain. Rabbi Drezin, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Abe. Good afternoon, everyone. If you're here in Baltimore, thank you for joining us on this chilly snow day. I just want to start by saying how honored I am to have been invited to moderate this conversation, which is kind of like a dialogue because it's just two of us once all the introductions have been made. But Imani, I first came to know you when I found your Unatana Toka for Black Lives just before the high holiday season of this year. And then I took it all around Baltimore. And then like weeks after the new year had begun, folks from Hizkiah reached out to me to ask if I would participate in this conversation with you in what felt like a really long time from now. But here we are, and just so grateful to you to share your wisdom with us and for the conversation that we are gonna jump into right now. So I want to start us this afternoon by just kind of framing the question of why are we having this conversation right now? And I know that we're all here to talk about what does it mean to raise an anti-racist child? And we have a whole bunch of questions that we're gonna get to pretty quickly. But I wanna, before we get started, kind of zoom out, pun intended, because we're living in a Zoom universe. But you know, I have been in Baltimore since 2012. And I have been wondering since May of 2020, why is it that these conversations are happening now? Why is it specifically in our Jewish community that there and broader that there seems to be a ripening of conversations that we could have started at other times. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about since May of 2020 is what was it about George Floyd's murder that kind of tipped the scale for us as a community and us as a Jewish community and us as a country to be talking about things that, at least as far as it relates to Baltimore, we weren't ready to do, or we hadn't realized we had a responsibility to do 5 years ago, say when Freddie Gray died in the hands of police custody. So I just want to name that question, and rather than spend too much time pontificating on it, because living in the theoretical is definitely not something that helps us in justice work, at least not without the action that we do on the ground. And I want to just kind of honor this moment that we've arrived at, and see what it is that we can do with this moment, and that we can do as we see more opportunities to have these conversations, to learn from one another, and to see institutions in our community kind of creating a platform in which we can do this learning together and these conversations can take place. So we're here to talk today about what it means to raise an anti-racist child. And before we can do that, we have to talk about the biggest non-secret, as Imani likes to call it, of raising an anti-racist child, and that is that we have to be oriented to anti-racism ourselves. And I just want to name that in probably April of 2020, the majority of our Jewish community locally and Jewish communities across the country were kind of talking about, we want to diversify our community. We have an increasing awareness that there are Jews of color and that there are non-white people and non-straight people in our community, and we want to figure out ways to bring people in. And a month later, we wanted to be anti-racist. And I think that there's a lot that we can do in the middle of those two things and that we'll need to do. And the first is to start with thinking about, when it comes to being a parent, which I am not, but Imani is, and I know many of you out there are, how do we prepare our children for a world that we may never inhabit, those of us who are white, and that the role of socialization. So Imani, before we get into this kind of back and forth question answers between us and then inviting our audience to ask their own questions, can you talk to us a little bit about how do we start this conversation that we're here to have about what it means to raise an anti-racist child, and to give us a little bit of a springboard to get into that conversation as you see fit, by way of some opening remarks and just initial thoughts.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to name a couple of things. One is that it took a lot of people and a lot of resources to make not just today happen, but the entire series. And I'm honored to be amongst folks who decided that it was a series and not a one-off that was required in this particular moment. And I also want to, it wasn't until I heard Eric Ward speak at my synagogue, Kolot Chayenu in Brooklyn, that I really recognized that Rosa Parks didn't just one day sit on a bus and feel tired and then voila, there was a boycott. I think the same can be said of last summer, right? Which is that for decades and centuries, folks have been organizing and resisting oppressive forces in our country, right from the Mennonites, who in the 1600s wrote, an abolitionist statement on, moral and religious grounds, right? They were like, we do not support this. This does not look like what we believe in. So as long as there's been oppression, there's also been resistance, and not just, and by everybody. I think one of the pieces around, I have never for myself asked, how do I raise an anti-racist child, right? That is a question I get asked a lot. And of course, I now spend a lot of time thinking about, you can see our 3 kiddos behind me when they were a little bit younger. That's the crew. They're now 20, 16, and 7. And, mostly what I was thinking about was, how do I make sure that my kids don't get crushed in the world? How do I make sure that my kids trust others, not based on identity, but based on experience? How do I make sure that they stay open? How do I make sure that people don't mistake, struggle for ineptitude, right? So as I'm thinking about this question that we spend a lot of time, as you said, focused on in a really new way, a lot has brought us to this moment, right? I think we're in May, we were at the 1-year anniversary of the release of the study from the Jews of Color Initiative that reminded us how diverse we are, right? It's not something we're trying to get. It is something we already have, right? But it's happening in pockets. And so the question around anti-racism is, why is it happening in pockets, right? So as we're thinking about being in spaces as Jewish people, and looking around, and we're saying, wow, there's a whole new set of skills that I want to develop. And we know that sometimes we develop things before our kids, like how to cook. We need to know that before we're teaching them how to do it, right? And there are other things that we develop alongside our kids, and that's also okay, right? Like relearning maybe even the solar system when they're in school, right? Relearning the new way to do reading with no tears now. Right, so there are a lot of things that we can learn alongside our kids, but I think one of the most important pieces generationally is that a lot of folks who are currently raising kids were raised with a race-blind ideology. That's people of all races, which is the idea that we don't see race, right? And I always say, especially in Jewish community, I say, what would it be like if somebody said, I don't see your Judaism. Like, what? You don't see my Judaism? Right? That would be hurtful. The only time it's not hurtful is when we feel safer by the fact that we're not seen that way. And the only reason we feel safer is because we were threatened, right? That our Judaism made us stick out. And so, I think that this idea of moving away from that is scary for people. And I think another piece in thinking about, what's the parental role is that we want to know where we are in our own racial identity development, right? There's lots of theory and research around racial identity development in the way that, for kids, we're like, we know when they cut their first tooth, we know when they're supposed to be speaking, but we don't know where they are in the cycle of racial identity development. And that's something that we can really attend to. So let's get down to the kids. What do we want to think about?
I appreciate that. I wonder, when you were just talking about how we want to know how to cook before we teach our kids to, and I wanted to make a joke about, or you want your kid to be really good at cooking because you're not. And I feel like that's applicable here too. And when we were talking to prepare for this conversation today, we were talking about this, and you were reflecting on, like, how far in front of my child do I need to be? And it had made you think about baking with your daughter. So you kind of just nodded to it, but as we go into this question of the children, can you just, for parents out there who think that they might need a master's degree in anti-racism in order to really get into that work, and for that kind of tendency, and let's name it, fear, concern, like trepidation, like I don't like to not lean in because you don't want to mess up, which not a secret, you're going to mess up all the time, right? Like, can you just say one more thing about that as we get into the child? Because I think that's so important. And I've only seen a few names that I recognize when I took a quick look into who's on this call today, but I know there are people out there who are like, can I do this? Because I don't want to be an imposter. And if I was raised differently, what does it look like to actually hope my child will be a better cook than me, right? Like, help my child set out to maybe learn things younger that we didn't learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said the most important piece, which is we are going to mess up. And one of my favorite slogans is better mistakes tomorrow, right? Dolly Chugh, who I fangirl after all the time, wrote a book called The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. It's an amazing read, personal narrative and research. And I think the other thing is that we think that silence is safety. We think if we don't say anything, we're not going to mess up. But what happens when we don't say anything is that the moral development of the child is left to the community, right? It's left to media, it's left to friends, it's left to overheard partial conversations, it's left to visually observing interactions between people and making stories. Kids make stories, And we want to help them make the right stories, right? We want to help them fill in the gaps. We want to help them interpret. And so I think speaking and making a mistake can be better than not speaking at all, than not saying anything at all. That we really, the other piece is that nobody does it alone, absolutely nobody. And so being in a community of practice, being in a community of parents, right, like these are places we can lean in. There's no shortage of information, right? Just tracking the New York Times bestseller list from the summer. Vashti Harrison, anything by her, right? Little Leaders, Women Leader. She's got just a collection at this point of appropriate children's books that are a starting place, right? Like this is called Beyond Books for a reason, right? The learning is a starting place, and then the acting is another place.
Well, that's a Jewish idea, learning and acting, and that they can't do one without the other. All right, well, let's talk about the kids. First, let's talk about we're talking about kids, and then we're talking about kind of like a bookend of 18 years in which like every 6 months developmentally things are changing. And so I'm going to invite you to kind of scaffold a little bit when I ask you a broad question that has like a few components of answers. But as we're talking about kids, and we're talking about really like starting early and setting a platform for or a precedence for conversations like this to grow as they grow. What do kids understand, and starting at what point? What don't they understand? How are they developing that we should be thinking about when we think about this topic, and how we want to engage our children in conversations in ways that will be meaningful and that will shape them, but will also be developmentally appropriate?
So kids notice everything, right? They notice right off, right? Now research is saying that within 6 months, kids notice difference of race, which is what I would, they won't label it race, but they notice difference in phenotype, pigment, hair, lips, hips, etc. And so I think that one of the pieces that is important to say is usually we teach kids right from the beginning to be thoughtful about things being fair and being kind, which are really important. And then with time, we start to desensitize them to those things because we actually can't hold it all. I think about the conversations I used to have with my daughter when she was 3.5, 4, walking to school, and the questions around homelessness and unemployment and addiction and joblessness, right? Like those, and there were a lot of touch points for that on our way to her school. And so in part, it is the recognizing where they're at. So starting from the kids from infancy, they start to notice differences. Children as young as 2 years old use race as a reason why people do things, right? You did this or you didn't do this because of your race. By 2.5, they're using race to choose playmates, right? So right from the beginning, right? Kids are doing what they do. They're categorizing, right? Which is something that we do as a survival strategy and a survival tool. They're perceiving, right? And then our job is just to give them language for that perception. And then they're categorizing. And sometimes that makes adults nervous, right? Because kids will label and will go, oh, don't say that, or maybe that's offensive. We want to help them use language that's open and inviting and respectful of people's dignity. So right from the beginning, really, they're noticing a lot about what is happening and who is getting treated in different ways, right? We know that young kids, elementary school, are thinking about fair a lot. And what we want to do is help them think about fair, not just about their own experience of fairness, but other people's experience of fairness, right? Not just fairness between two people, but fairness about what people give maybe in our schools, right? What people give and get inside of our institutions, right? That's how we look. I'm weaving in the 4 I's right there, right? So the 4 I's are individual or internal, interpersonal, institutional, and ideological. And those things are woven together.
Mm.
And kids can get it.
You're talking in these 4 I's, and I think about this kind of just vast process of socialization that happens just as soon as we come into the world by no choice of our own, so you're born to a Jewish family where there's not a lot of Jews, so you grow up with a multiracial community, and you even have Jews of color who are a part of your synagogue community, right? In contrast to you randomly are born into a pretty insular Jewish community, and maybe you don't see as many Jews of color, maybe your friend group is less multiracial. Even you don't choose those things, but the trajectory. And I was also thinking about how we celebrate our young kids' ability to point things out when it's got a positive connotation. But I think about, right, like one of the worst things that could happen for some people in a certain mindset is, oh, that kid just called that person fat, because they're just naming something that doesn't necessarily have the value judgment that as adults we're responding to if we're like embarrassed because someone just said that. And I use that as an example, but here we're talking about race, so we can think about that example as too. So Imani, tell me, what does it actually mean to raise an anti-racist child? What does that look like? What is the difference between raising an anti-racist child and raising a good person, or raising someone who may not be right? There's all this gray area in between, and I think in so many aspects of life we need to kind of disrupt the binary. So talk to me about what your definition is of raising an anti-racist child, and if you could try and identify for us some of those clear indicators of what makes parenting actively anti-racist, in contrast to just trying to raise your child to be nice to others and be kind, and some of these things that you were mentioning in your previous comments.
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap. That's the first thing that I'll say. Raising an anti-racist child means raising a child who's against racism, right? And so that seems simple, but understanding racism is kind of a whole other thing, right? So in order to understand racism, we understand that we have all been raced, right? Whether we like it or not, we've all been raced, and that started a long time ago, right? If I think about, for example, the 1790 census, United States, those categories, the racial categories that were established, free white man, free white woman, slave, and other free people, right? Everything from before that, certainly, but from that point on, like, we are responding consistently to how the outcomes are different, right? So we have to have a way of explaining why Black women have more college debt than anyone else. We have to have a way of explaining why Black and Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by COVID. And one of the ways that we explain that is racism, right? And there are a lot of pieces to that. So when we think about working with our kids, think about being with our kids, they already know that things are not fair, and we wanna broaden their sense of not fair. So sometimes not fair is, I got the broken cookie and you got the whole one, right? That's a real, or I worked really hard for an A, but I got a B plus, right? That's another piece. But I think what we want to think about and focus on is, what does it mean to have equal outcomes, equal access, right? So for example, the other day, my daughter and I were walking to the subway, and she was like, "It is so cold." And I was like, "It is so cold. And do you know that a lot of people are outside right now because they don't have homes," right? She's a very kind person. My daughter is a very kind person, right? But sometimes we need to pull back the lens for them so that they can start to see where, for a long time, the unkindnesses have been heaped on some people more than others. And what does that mean about how successful they can be, even though they are bright and brilliant and they have talent and they want to do things, right? But maybe they don't know what the opportunities are, or they don't have folks who can. I think a lot about this with the students that I teach. I teach high school. Who is available to high school students to show up for them and ferry them to the places that they have to go, and what kind of family structure you have to be in to be able to do that. The school that I work at, for example, has parent conferences in the afternoon and at night, right? Which the school that I previously worked at did not, right? It's like, you know, when parent conferences are, you come in when you can come in. But the idea that we would think about parents who might work a 9 to 5 and not just parents who have personal days, et cetera. These are different ways of thinking about anti-racism without saying, I'm doing this anti-racist act. We're making access more equitable. We're noticing, right? Like in Jewish community, we notice the most important part of the tallis, of the parashal, the tzitzit, right? Who are the people at the fringes? Why are they there? How can we learn their stories? How can we stand beside them? How can, when somebody says, you know, I don't want to play with you because you're going to make me dirty with your skin, we say, I'm going to go stand with that person, right? I'm going to go stand with that person.
You know, I'm thinking back to this question I raised at the beginning of like, why now? And as you're talking about the opportunity that we have when we are responding to our young people to expand their viewpoint, and thinking specifically about the last 10 months since COVID kind of started to impact all of our lives, to even think about that in our own kind of homeostasis, right? All the things that I might be limited to do, and to recognize and map my own privilege of the things that I could be grateful to have, right? Like a job that allows me to work from home, which is not true of everyone in my house, but it's true of me. The opportunity to be employed, the opportunity to have been healthy, right? Like, and some of the exponential risks that people are at, that if you apply the filter, we at this point can't deny the disproportionate impact of Black, Indigenous, people of color, Black and Brown people specifically, who like have this kind of like, you can look at all these things as their own isolated individual experiences, but if you start to map over what certain people have in common with other people and the resources, we see it, right? We see these maps coming out, and that's one thing that I think maybe why now is, you know, a lot of cracks have been exposed during these last 10 months, almost year, and some of them are bubbling up, right? We can't just pretend. I've been just starting Isabel Wilkerson's cast, and I know some folks who have been part of these groups have been reading it together, and I'm like, oh yeah, that bubbling, that like mold is coming through my wall now. So, and I didn't build this house, but I live in it, for anyone who's reading it. So I want to follow up on a question that my friend Dr. Harriet Wims asked, that's related to this question we're on, and ask you to kind of lean into some of like, what are these specific things that parents can do? The question Dr. Wims asked is, what happens when our children become angry or upset, or how do we navigate kind of the emotions that come with their developmental stage and the leaning into trying to raise an anti-racist child? So specifically, I want to ask about kind of emotional reactions and how to balance through that. And then I think the other question I want to ask, and you can speak to them in the order that makes sense, there's probably some overlap, is, all right, well, if I have to, as an adult, accept that I live in a sea of racist socialization, how do I raise an anti-racist child? And what is the process of also unlearning racism? And those all seem just like classes I should have taken in school, but it's not theoretical and it's not academic. It's very embodied if we're really doing it. So if you could speak to a few of those ideas, I'd be grateful.
Sure. I'm not sure I got the touch point between feeling emotions and anti-racists.
So the question that Dr. Wims asked specifically was, was what can we do when trying to raise an anti-racist child if the child starts to become angered about the history of system oppression? That's the question, directly.
Yeah, that's great. First of all, it's great if they're angry. It's real. It's so good. It's so good. It's so unfair, right? It's deeply unfair, and they should be angry about it. I think what we do is we build the sense that there's something to do, right? That they can do something about it. And that other people, and part of the way we do this is we point them to other people who have done something about it, right? We say, this is what our values tell us is okay, and this is how we live. Look at us doing it, right? I think in this moment, I'm thinking about the Making Mensch's project from the Foundation for Jewish Camps that looks at the midot, right? Like, what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics that bring us? This is intensely Jewish work, in my opinion, right? This is really values consistent work. So I think there are two important things to say. One is that we want to be able to build, as much as we want to build anti-racist movements and moments, we also want to build racial intimacy, right? So we want our children to be able to develop real relationships with people who feel similarly and are aligned ideologically, and will share some of the other stories, right? Share some of the other stories about what's their experience, right? How is it impacting them? And that interpersonal level change is really critical, right? Because we don't do this work without relationships. And we have to lean into those relationships when we're getting ready to do the work. And so I think, being anti-racist is both a lot bigger than what we think, and it's a lot smaller too than what we think. I think about when I watched, so I co-watch TV with my kid. I'm the annoying parent who watched Pocahontas and was like, isn't it interesting when they arrived that they felt like they could just take what was there, right? There's like these questions to my daughter as we're watching TV. So that's something that we often do together. Or, for example, the other night when the vote was being affirmed, I said to my daughter, she always likes to read at night. I said, are you going to read, or are you going to read tonight? She said, yeah. I said, okay, so then you need to get ready and get in bed. And she said, actually, I think this is very important. And she sat down and she took out, she's 7, she took out a pad and she said, I'm going to write down who's good, who's bad, and who's in the middle of the Congress people who are speaking. And so she was like, So she was, what's their name again? And she was just writing things down, and she kept looking at us. The whole family was watching TV together, right, and processing it. And you were talking earlier about the binary, right? I said, well, they're not everybody's good and not everybody's bad. Sometimes people say the right thing at the right time, or sometimes people get scared and they say the wrong thing and they're only thinking of themselves. And she's like, yeah, that's why I put the middle. She was very clear. She had anticipated this, and so I think it's good if our kids get angry, and just like when they get angry at anything else, the question is how do we deal with that? The anger is justified, but the feeling is not healing, right? So, like, okay, let's get empowered, and also let's do some strategies about feeling angry, right? Not that it's not okay to feel angry, but we want to direct it. We want to use it to propel ourselves. And Jesse, you had a second question, which was about grownups, but I can't remember what it was.
I just want to lift up though that I love what you said about it's both really big and not, right? Like I imagine a lot of the parents that are listening to this conversation right now would kind of know their game plan for when their kid gets mad at them because they didn't get their way, or because they lied about cleaning up something or right? Like all of the things that, are like, oh yeah, I've done that before and I would know how to handle that. And what I hear you saying is almost like we have to, it's both like its own approach and also similar to that parenting style of how would you engage anger in other areas? And my assumption is depending on whether the anger was valid or whether, I'm picturing the emotion wheel and thinking about that and your invitation to parents to say, let's not make this the thing that's so big that we can't touch it, right? We talk all the time, like, should Jewish education and should the Torah be like a playground or a museum? And with no disrespect to the amazing museums, actually, I don't know about the Reginald Lewis Museum, but I do know that the Jewish Museum often has a lot of interactive like exhibits because we want you to touch and we want you to play. And I think sometimes we do that with our Jewish experience. So I want to, the other question that I'd asked about was, and if you could just speak briefly to this, because there's a couple more questions I want to get, and we're going to be opening it up to other folks' questions in just a few minutes, is kind of, okay, if I'm at the point where I realize that like I have grown up as a parent informed by racism, how do I raise an anti-racist child? And just even like one or two, like, here are ways you can start. You've already named some of them for us, so I want to just acknowledge you've already started to share some of them, but are there any additional that you might add at this point?
So I think you've already started if you're asking the question. That's the first thing. And I wouldn't underestimate the question itself. It's like, wait, let me see where I am in this. Another piece of thing is to see, often when we talk about racism, we talk about the negative impact it has on people of color. And we don't often talk about the negative impact it has on white people, right? You were saying, Jesse, that you're reading Caste, and I love that Wilkerson uses presumed beneficiaries. Right? It's so evocative, right? Presumed beneficiaries of this system. Paul Kivel has a ton of pieces on what's the harm to white people. Sarah Hershey, let me see if I can think about what her blog is called. It'll come to me in a minute. She has a great piece specifically around Jewish folks and what's the impact to white Jewish folks of racism. I'll pull it up in a second, but really just a beautiful piece about like, wow, this is how it messes us up. So I think knowing that that we have a stake in the game is a really critical piece of learning. And then it's motivated not by altruism, but by self-interest, which is also, I think, an important interest to have in ending anti-racism, right? Like if we don't know how it's hurting us, then sometimes we disinvest partway through. We lose steam. Yeah, that's the brief answer.
No, that's a good brief answer, and it leads to the question I want to ask next. Let's talk about Jews for a moment, and specifically, let's talk about Jews who are white-facing. And I am one of them, just in case it's not obvious to everyone, but I assume it is. And I know that it is often the case where those of us who are white presenting Jews may have encountered anti-Semitism or marginalization ourselves. And sometimes the tendency can be to be defensive of like kind of our own oppression, and we may or may not extend that out to then seeing it where it exists in other places. The other day, my friend Yoshi Silverstein said yesterday, oppression is not a slice of pie. Like it's not like if you like mine will be less whole if like yours is like there too, right? So I want to think for a moment, and I want to ask you to reflect on for those of us who are white Jews, who may either have a tendency to not see ourselves as white. For me, I always say, it may be true that I see myself differently, but if I was pulled over by the police, how would that police officer likely see me? I think that's an important question for us to ask ourselves when we think about not just how I see myself, but how I present. That's why I use that language of presenting white. But how can we use our experiences of oppression to help our children understand the nature of oppression and interrupt it when they see it? And I'm going to add a more challenging question to go with that. What do you think white Jews need to consider when we think about our own tendencies to think about anti-Semitism or other marginalized experiences we might have had, and kind of the opportunities to leverage that for for good work towards raising anti-racist children, or the cautions we might need to be aware of, where we might slip up because we're distracted by that, or we don't see beyond our own single example of it.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think we all want to be safe. That's the first thing. We all want to be safe, and that standing up for what is wrong makes us stand out. Right? There's a lot at risk when we stand up for others, and some people have more to risk than others in standing up. Right? I think that the history of Jews in the U.S. And the sacrifices and the scapegoating that have gone on over years around politically progressive movements is really that's collective memory, right? That's collective memory. And so when we think about going out on the ledge on behalf of other people, sometimes we worry that we'll be in the same place as our predecessors. And at the same time, I think, so I would just say that, like, it's important to have compassion for ourselves and the risks and dangers we're able to take on, and to make sure that they are right-sized for us. And I'll say that I think, it's really challenging to remember that we will all be better, that there are more people who are subjugated by this hierarchy of oppressions than not. And that it is in coming together that we actually have a chance to improve it, not just for me or on my behalf, but for all of us. And that's really hard to do because we deal with these, what Dr. Barbara Love calls wedge issues, right? Like, race is the wedge that has divided communities, organizing efforts, for years. And anti-Semitism is another wedge issue, I would say, right? Like, we were going to be in solidarity together, but then anti-Semitism reared up, and now I'm not sure I'm safe here, right? So I think having compassion for that, but also anticipating it, right? Anticipating that this is going to happen, that in some moment somebody is going to make a racialized remark, make an anti-Semitic remark, and that we can equip our allies with a language so that they know, that's an anti-Semitic trope. I do not consider it a compliment that you think I'm good with money. I consider it harmful and scary. Oh, really? That's information for people who don't have the whole backstory, right? So that's a little bit of it, I would say.
I'm going to ask one last question. And I'm going to move into the questions that are not mine or that we didn't necessarily talk about that have come from the audience since we've been speaking. But I was thinking about, one of the primary goals of white supremacy is that the Jews will definitely not start a series that's called Jews of Colors, Jewish Institutions, and Jewish Community in the Age of Black Lives Matter, because that would mean that Jews are not just sitting there talking about only themselves and the Jews who are not white in their community. We're also talking about something much bigger. And if we realize that we are ultimately all more powerful together as groups who have been siloed and marginalized, we might actually show the power and the momentum that we have. So the last question I have is, well, what do I do if I live in a mostly white world and I don't have any friends who are Black, or I don't have those relationships myself, which a lot of people have whispered in my ear in these last few months. So I have thoughts on how we can do that, but I'm just curious, for those who are sitting here thinking, I live in a silo, I don't know if the world I live in reflects the world I want my child to see themselves in. What do you say to that? And then we're going to move to audience questions.
Well, I think the subtext of those comments and those fears and those hopes, right? Those hopes for it being different is really that race only is happening when people of color are present.
Absolutely.
Right? Race is happening all the time. It's operating all the time. In fact, it's operating in the fact that the only people around me look like me, for example. right? I was listening to a talk a couple weeks ago by Kenji Yoshino, who's a law professor at NYU, and he was showing these charts of what our neighborhoods would look like if, thinking about who might surround us in terms of neighbors, if we only wanted 2 people to be like us rather than 3 people. And it essentially showed like a map of almost complete segregation and a map of integration, right? So race is happening in that we look around in Jewish community and we mostly see white people, right? Alana Kaufman says 1 in 7. If so, 1 in 7, we should look really different. So I think let's take away the idea that we can't think about race unless there are some brown people around who can help us with it. The only way to get brown people around is to think about race, right? Is to think about race and who we are in it and how it shows up in us, right? Even as Jews, right? One of the things I remember saying at a training I was participating in, and I didn't mention this before, but I think it's worth mentioning, that as Jews, some of us are marked and some of us are unmarked. And that the more marked we are, the more already threatened we feel by our environment, right? So I just want to put that out there, right? That I don't wear a kippah in the world, right? I wear my Magen David, which even when people see me wearing it, they don't know I'm Jewish, right? I was doing an interview once and I was wearing it, and the parent who was interviewing with me started explaining to me what bat mitzvah was of her child. And I was like, wow, this is really a hard nugget, right? So I just would say, we can talk about it, we can learn about it, we can change who we are, we can change how we respond to comments that other people make. That is how racism begins to be undone, right? Like, I need folks who don't look like me working on this in rooms I could never enter safely.
Thank you. This is from one of our attendees. I'm gonna ask this question. Is there a language that you can suggest that is developmentally appropriate for talking to children at various ages about what race is and isn't, and how to understand the visual categories they are noticing and sometimes naming? It's a specific question, but sometimes it's helpful to have phrases or responses to practice or try out. So I think that what we're being asked for here is like, so what is a developmentally appropriate way to respond to a child who's noticing race? And this is the situation. So my assumption is it could be in it could be in a neutral way, like a child who's pointing out something, but let's assume that there's like an association that's happening. That person is Black, right? Like, can you either give us 1 or 2 examples of how someone might respond in a moment, or something that a parent might say if they notice their child either just naming something that has neutral value or something that might skew to having some sort of association with it?
Well, one of the things I tell my kid when she's coupling things that don't necessarily go together, right, or which we call implicit associations. If you haven't seen the Harvard implicit association tests and research, then do. It's beautiful. One of the things, the first thing that often happens is this person is different than me. No, so far so good, right? And they're different than me in this particular way. Okay, yes, maybe, perhaps. And then I'm better than them because of this thing, or they are worse than me because of this thing. That's where we want to be able to intervene, right? We want to be able to say, we are different, right? Like, I think one of the things I was thinking in particular about facial features, right? Like, why do Black people tend to have broad noses? Why do Asian people tend to have more closed eyes, right? And thinking about what it meant to me to learn the genetic why of that, right? Like, when you're breathing through air that is dry, you need to have bigger nostrils. When you are walking in places that are windy, you don't want to have your eyes open so much. So this is how this is about region though, not about race, right? We now have conflated it with race, but it's not the same thing. And so I think, those two things. One is kind of being curious about it. Yeah, that is a difference. I wonder why. Let's go find out. And the other thing is, trying to detach the value from it, either the superiority or the inferiority that might come with it.
Great. I want to just remind those who are tuned in, if you are on the Zoom platform and have a question, you can put it into the Q&A slot. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also put a question into the comment section there. We have moderators there who can bring it to us. I've got at least 3 questions I want to ask, so I'm just giving you a sense of what's there and what could come.
Okay.
I'm going to start here with a question about someone who grew up in a racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically diverse community, and whose parents were intentional about doing so. Yet this parent feels like, they feel like it was helpful and naturally working to be an anti-racist. However, currently, as a parent, they are raising their children in a mostly white community. How can this parent and others like this parent work to expose their children to people of color, ethnicity, etc.? And is this an important part of raising an anti-racist child?
Yeah, I feel like we grazed by this one earlier, but I will say that I think it is important to be in communities where not everybody looks like oneself. I mean that for anybody. And it's important not to expect other people to be the diversity experience for our children, right? Like we're going to go to the place, like I don't head up to Yeshiva University to say to my daughter, this is what Orthodox people look like. That's not okay, right? That's not an okay way to enter into that conversation. And so I think equally, we want to find things that our kids are into and maybe take them out of the place where we would generally do it with them. And then I know, I'm thinking about Dr. Ali Michael, who writes a lot about whiteness, especially in education. And she told a story once about intentionally taking her child, let's say it was to swimming, I can't remember, to swimming in a neighborhood where the offerings would be in a multiracial community. And upon arriving, the room was already segregated. Like people were sitting in different places. Think middle school dance by gender, right? People were sitting in different places, and the people who looked like her were trying to invite her in toward them in that multiracial space, right? And so we want to be mindful about that magnet, that wanting to stay together, even when we go to the great lengths to be in integrated situations, right? And just so you know, like we're not segregated by accident. We're segregated by many, 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 many centuries of intentionality. So it's hard to overcome, but important.
I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that, the organization that I lead in town, Repair the World, that we engage in service as a way to, not just contribute to an urgent need that exists, but to both like educate to the issues that are causing that need to exist in the first place. We try to create opportunities where people will encounter one another and build relationships with one another. And I think that's just one example, but I see more and more opportunities where people are realizing that we do all these programs, but are we facilitating building community and relationships? And I think that it feels like another one of those things that feels so obvious, but if you're sitting out there and you're listening, you're like, but I still don't know what to do. I would say look for that opportunity where you are going to put yourself somewhere where you have some sort of common interest or shared interest where other people are going to place themselves too, but to do so intentionally where you will be at a expanded cross-section of who you might meet there, which I understand is a little bit difficult right now in January of this global pandemic year, but my hope is by the fall of this 2021, maybe as we're reemerging, to just think about those types of opportunities and to seek them out because they're becoming.
And I would say harder right now, but also easier right now.
We
can go anywhere. We can be in any room. I mean, the programming that I took the Jewish programming that I took my daughter to at the beginning of the pandemic were places I would never go.
Yep.
They're places I would never go because I wouldn't want to be in the neighborhood because we would be microaggressed. They're places I wouldn't go when people could see us enter the room because it would be challenging. But for her to attend something online where the camera was on the actor and not on herself, I was like, this is great. We can do all of this Jewish programming that I would never take her to, because I would have to manage the cognitive load of walking into the room with her in X neighborhood or Y sanctuary.
So I want to name that is a great opportunity. I want to ask the question of our institutions and our leadership, what are we going to do to make it so that that decision doesn't have to be made by parents who are people of these primary identities that fear just showing up will require labor of them that we say on our websites we would never even see ourselves as creating, right? This question comes from a person who speaks as a Black Jew of color. And the question is about, how do we keep a balance of pride in one's race and or identity while ensuring we don't ourselves become racist or anti-other?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that the word pride can be hard, right? So what I would direct us to is, I mean, look, I'm super proud, so don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is that the word proud can be misinterpreted depending on the context. And that there's a significant amount of evidence that suggests that our self-concept is made up of both our individual experiences, who we are we an introvert, are we extrovert, what do we experience, and also our group identity. And so it's important, I think, to say to folks, to say to our kids, right? Part of we are proud. I think Joe Biden said this a million years ago when he was maybe exiting office, that his dad taught him, you are no better than anyone else, and no one else is any better than you, right? And so we can feel really happy about the things that we offer, and we recognize also that other people offer other things. I don't worry so much about like disliking other people. I think that that's something we have to deal with kind of in a race conscious way, but independent of race. I think what I worry about most is my child deciding she's going to be afraid, right? Like when she started being hyper vigilant about the police outside of our building over the summer, right? She came in, she said, Mommy, that, in Spanish, she said, Mommy, the police are going like this outside. What does that mean? Right? That made me nervous. And also I think just disaggregating people, right? We try not to talk about white people, right? As a group, we try to talk about people so that she can get a sense that people are different. What they bring are different, right? Our values maybe be value centered rather than identity centered. And I think that's sometimes where we can sometimes go astray. It's conflating those things.
I want to take a pause so we can all just let that sink in, because I think that was so important. Values centered instead of identity centered. I'm going to ask one more audience question, then I'm going to give you a chance, Imani, to have a last word as part of, you can answer that question, and then we'll take turns. Each of us will have a last word, and then we'll wrap up and thank everyone for being here this afternoon. So the last question that I want to ask is, when a child returns from school and says, people at my school segregate themselves based on identity, how do I break into the circles of people who are not physically similar to me? What should someone say to their child?
Depends on the age of the child, obviously, but I would, at least as a parent, try to make sure I internalize what the word segregate actually means versus the experience that my child is having. The likelihood that people segregate themselves is unlikely. And I think it's really developmentally appropriate, back to the racial identity development models, right? It's really, it's appropriate that people go through a period called immersion, right? That we want to be around people who affirm who we are, and let us know we're okay and feel validated. And I think that I don't know what breaking in means exactly, but I think it means I want to reach out. I want to connect. So I'm going to take it in that light. and say that one of the ways to connect is to connect with an individual, right? Because they exist in other places besides in the group at some point, whether it's arriving to school or leaving school. So as to connect with an individual where, again, there might be some overlap in terms of interest or affinity, and say, hey, I want to connect.
And sometimes it's not in the schoolroom. It's because you're on the same basketball team, or it's because, right, you end up in chorus together, or whatever those things are. But I think your point about shared experience, what we have in common with one another, what we would do to connect with other people we were just trying to meet. I think something you've said in this conversation that I keep coming back to, and that I will take away from this, is this reminder of, this is both a very big thing and a very kind of like, well, how would you do this if this wasn't race that we were talking about? And I'm not suggesting that there's not a certain degree of care and intention and responsibility that comes with something than just like, you know, what if my kid wants to wear something and I'm totally embarrassed that I'm going to be seen out in public with them? The rabbis would say a lahavdil. It's not the same thing, but sometimes we might make it into this big thing as a way of creating our own obstacles to just getting into that work, right? And into those relationships that may be more similar than they are different, if we're not just looking to kind of tick up the number of people who look differently than me in my kind of social Rolodex, I think. Imani, I want to give you one last word before we wrap up. And I will say my last word before you do, that there has been a text in the Torah that I read all the time, but this year has created a new meaning for me. And it's in section Deuteronomy 15, where the Torah says, there will be no needy people among your community. And then the following 7 or 8 sentences are about how to treat people, because that vision that there shall be no needy is actually not realistic. There's plenty of people who are in need and plenty of work to do. So the Torah actually goes on to tell us how to do it with fairness, and how to do it with human dignity, and how to do it with kindness. And I think when we have these conversations, we're looking to that same kind of, we should live in a world that has no racism, but we live in a world that has racism. So what are the things we do? And I hope we've gotten to do some of that in this conversation today. And as you mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a series. And so it's not a one-off, and that the invitation that we are in a time where we were asking this question, why now, that we continue to also ask, so what's next? So those are my final words, other than gratitude to you, Imani. And I'm going to let you have the last words before Trillian comes on to say goodbye and thank you to everyone.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking and learning together. You know, and I'm continually learning. I don't want anybody to feel like, you know, this is the end of the story, right? Something I said here today needs refinement, needs deeper analysis, needs deeper connection. We know how to do this. We actually do know how to do this. We've done this before, right? We've done this before for our community and together. How do we make people feel more whole? How do we make people feel like they belong? And when my kid meets your kid, what do you want to be possible for them? And what do you never want to see? Right? Those are the questions that will drive us to continue our curiosity and our learning together. So I'm really, really grateful to be here, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you both so much. I know you've given me just a ton to think about in terms of raising my own children, and I get the sense from the comments that we're seeing in chat that everyone has just found this conversation to be so valuable. So thank you. I want to just take 2 seconds to thank our partners for the program today, Hizuk Emunah and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. As a reminder, we're going to drop into chat again that link to register and explore the programs that have already taken place in the series. There's also the next program in the series is coming up on February 21st, which is a tech study class with Rabbi Weschler of Hizuk Emunah. So I encourage you to register for that. We're also going to pop in a couple links to some programs coming up from the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, which I again encourage you to have a look at. They've got programs coming up on February 3rd and February 15th. I also just want to take 2 seconds to say thank you so much to our captioner this evening or this afternoon, Shari, and thank you again to Ms. Chapman and to Rabbi Dressin. Thank you so much for guiding us through this conversation. And I think with that, that is everything. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope we see you all very soon again at our sort of virtual JMM. So thank you so much. Have a good evening.